This presentation was developed by the League of Women Voters. The League's mission is to protect and strengthen democracy by urging citizens to be informed voters. The League is nonpartisan and doesn't advocate for or against any politician, candidate for office, or political party. The League does develop positions on issues that relate to our core mission, such as transparency in government, voter rights, and civic engagement. We work for fair elections by providing objective information to the public. The title of this presentation is Democracy in the Balance. Our democracy was designed to balance the interests of many groups. It is expected that there is a push-pull, give-and-take nature to creating that balance. As a country, we have a history of situations where the balance of interests tilted representative government significantly in one direction, creating an imbalance. We also have a history of actions taken to address those tilts. Many believe that we are facing a time of serious imbalance now. This presentation is an effort to explain why that concern exists. The information in this presentation provides an overview of the history of challenge to our democracy and our available options today for resetting the balance in our own time of challenge. The League, in addition to many citizens across the country, sees disturbing trends in our nation today. In reviewing progress on issues related to League positions, we see our elected representatives failing to take action on a whole host of critical issues, ranging from climate change, to voting rights, to gun control, to jobs, to student debt, to public education and investment in the future. Is there a connection between the extraordinary sums of money candidates need to run for elected office today, growing polarization of the electorate, and the lack of progress on these issues? As mentioned in the introduction, this is not a new problem. Our nation has a long history of the influence of money in our political system, as well as a long history of the public's response to the corruption it engendered. This cartoon, published in 1889 during the Gilded Age, is by Joseph Kepler, the editor of Puck, a popular satirical weekly of the time. The cartoon depicts the growing impact of business interests in the United States and its oversized influence in Congress. The large figures in the top tier of the chamber represent the industry giants of the day: coal, copper, steel, and oil. They are squeezing their way through the Senate door labeled "Entrance for Monopolists." Right below them are the much smaller figures of senators. The quote from the Gettysburg Address, "The government by the people and for the people," has been revised to read, "Government by the monopolists and for the monopolists." A sign above the chamber reads, "People's Entrance Closed." The people's anger over political corruption during the Gilded Age persuaded President Theodore Roosevelt and Congress that they must respond. The Tillman Act in 1907 made it unlawful for any national bank or any corporation to make a money contribution in connection with any election to any political office. This was followed by the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, which established the first public disclosure regulations. In 1947, with the rise of Union strength after World War II, Congress reacted to business concerns and passed the Taft-Hartley Act, banning unions from contributing to political campaigns. In the early 1970s, in response to campaign abuses and the Nixon-Watergate campaign scandal, Congress passed the most unprecedented and sweeping campaign finance reforms in history, the Federal Election Campaign Act, or FECA. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, better known as the McCain-Feingold Act, was a response to Supreme Court decisions that were causing an increase in often inflammatory advertising by third-party groups, so-called 527 organizations, 30 or 60 days prior to an election. Also, because the Supreme Court had ruled that a person could contribute unlimited amounts to one's own election, McCain-Feingold sought to balance the playing field by adding safeguards to make a publicly financed candidate competitive. But while legislation attempted to reduce undue influence and corruption, over the last 40 years the Supreme Court has whittled away this legislation bit by bit to the point where money reigns in our political system yet again. Today, just a handful of funders determine the candidates and the issues. Supreme Court decisions since 1976 have overturned the limits on candidates' contributions to their own campaigns, overturned the limits on campaign expenditures by candidates and PACs, overturned the ban on corporations spending to influence referenda and ballot questions, and in 2008 overturned the provision in the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Act that allowed publicly financed candidates to compete on a level playing field with well-backed or wealthy competitors. This brings us to January 2010 and the Supreme Court decision in the case of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. Citizens United is important for three reasons. First, the decision reaffirmed the 1976 Supreme Court decision that the expenditure of money is a form of free speech. Second, it narrowed the definition of corruption. Prior to 2010, and as recently as 2003, the Supreme Court held that government had a legitimate interest in preventing, quote, corruption threatened by large financial contributions and the appearance of corruption that might result from those contributions, end quote. With the Citizens United decision, the court reduced the meaning of corruption to a simple quid pro quo, direct bribery. Third, the court declared that corporations have the same protected First Amendment political speech rights as humans. As a direct result of the Citizens United decision, corporations, unions, and other entities are now permitted to openly, legally, and secretively spend unlimited amounts of money to influence the political process. With the Citizens United decision, the court overturned a century of legislation and judicial decisions limiting the corrupting influence of money in politics. This is a contemporary rendition of the decision by political cartoonist Matt Worker. It shows the 5 majority Supreme Court justices in the Citizens United decision sitting atop a giant spigot labeled corporate money, and turning the faucet handle to unleash the corporate dollars about to swamp a voter. With several election cycles since the decision, a clear trend is evident. This graph offers a case in point. The horizontal bars represent total spending on federal elections from 1998 to 2012 in billions of dollars. The light green bars show congressional spending. The dark green segments show spending in presidential elections. The amount of spending in campaigns was relatively stable from 1980 to 2000. The uptick began after the 2000 presidential election with the influx of money from a new source, 527 groups. MoveOn.org and SwiftBoat Veterans for Truth were major players in the 2004 presidential election. Because 527s are regulated under IRS rules and not the Federal Election Commission, there are no limits on contributions to 527s and no spending limits imposed on these organizations. Campaign spending surged along with negative advertising. With its 2010 decision, the Supreme Court opened the money spigot even further by overturning the ban on corporations using corporate funds to influence elections. Today, corporations and big money donors can contribute and spend unlimited amounts to support or oppose candidates and ballot initiatives through super PACs. This slide illustrates that 57% of all individual donations to super PACs in the 2012 campaign came from just 47 people, each of whom gave over $1 million. The orange section of the pie chart represents the money from the 47 donors. The smaller gray area represents all the rest of the donations. Those 47 individuals represented 0.000015% of the U.S. population in 2012. But 527s and super PACs have a serious disadvantage to big donors and corporations: disclosure requirements. Fearful of a backlash from name recognition, big money donors seek completely anonymous ways to influence candidates and elections. One workaround has been a loophole in the IRS tax code for 501c4 social welfare organizations. Lack of clarity in the IRS guidelines related to 501c4s has allowed corporations and individuals to filter money to support or oppose a candidate or ballot question without disclosure. As you can see in this graph, these new politically active 501c4 groups, represented by the red bar, have well outspent the usual campaign funding sources, giving rise to the term secret or dark money. And this increase in spending reaches beyond presidential and congressional elections, creeping into down-ballot races and local ballot referenda, as we saw in California's 2012 GMO labeling ballot initiative. Also, in 2012, Chevron spent $1.2 million in a campaign backing 3 candidates friendly to the fossil fuel industry for city council in Richmond, California. This slide charts the escalation in undisclosed money from 1999 to 2012. How high that total will go in 2014 is anyone's guess. How does secret money flow into and through the system? The next 2 slides provide graphic illustrations of how the money moves. This slide is from a Washington Post article published on January 5, 2014, entitled "Koch-Backed Political Coalition Designed to Shield Donors Raised $400 Million in 2012." Based on research by investigative reporters from the Post and the Center for Responsive Politics, the chart shows the network of politically active nonprofit groups backed by the Kochs and fellow donors to shield donors in the 2012 election. Quoting from the Post article, "The resources and the breadth of the Koch-backed organization make it singular in American politics, an operation conducted outside the campaign finance system, employing an array of groups aimed at stopping what its financiers view as government overreach." End quote. This chart of the Koch funding network is from OpenSecrets.org. If you are finding that seeing the details of these charts is difficult, getting closer or making them larger won't help. Both charts are examples of the funding mechanisms currently allowed under law. The network is deliberately complex by design, but is highly coordinated. Members of the coalition target different constituencies, but together have mounted attacks on the new healthcare law, federal spending, and environmental regulations. Even though disclosure was upheld in the Supreme Court Citizens United decision, more and more secret money is flooding the system because Congress has refused to enact disclosure regulation. Knowing where the money is coming from is now more difficult than ever. And the assault on the few remaining safeguards is not over. Citizens United was decided in 2010, in time for the 2012 elections. With the 2016 elections fast approaching, the court, in its April 2014 McCutcheon decision, has added even more money to the deluge by lifting the aggregate limits on contributions going directly to candidates and campaign committees from $123,000 to $3.6 million. Donors may now give the maximum permissible amount to each and every candidate and party committee they choose. Many believe that the court is well on its way to eliminating all limits in a quest to completely deregulate American political campaigns. As attorney and legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin has stated, if you believe that money is speech, as the Supreme Court majority does, then most campaign finance limits become unconstitutional. League of Women Voters President Elizabeth McNamara describes the decision in stark terms. This is yet another irresponsible decision on money in politics by the Roberts Court. The court has used the McCutcheon decision to continue dismantling the wall of protection against corruption, case by case, brick by brick. In this decision, as in previous decisions, the Chief Justice ignores the corruption he is turning loose in America's election system. In this decision, the court opens another loophole by allowing our political parties to be further corrupted by big money contributions from special interests. The party and political action committee systems now become a huge funnel for corrupting elected officials across the country. The McCutcheon decision simply means more power for big money, more corruption for the rest of us. The Roberts Court is saying that big money is worth more than the voices of individual citizens." End quote. A recent study from Princeton professor Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page of Northwestern, as well as studies from Trinity University and UC Berkeley, corroborate the perception of politics in America today. As this excerpt from the Princeton study points out, the shift in influence is not a recent phenomenon, but a fact that has been in place for several decades. However, recent Supreme Court decisions, the excesses of corporate greed, the violations of the public trust, and the Occupy movement have made the situation much more vivid and visible to the public. With money, once again, looming over and corrupting our political system, where do we go from here? If we agree change is needed, how can change be made? The tools for change in our system of government are legislation, regulation, and constitutional change through the amendment process or reversals of Supreme Court decisions. There is current action in all three of these change sectors. Above all, we need to keep in mind that action must happen at all levels of government, local, state, and national. The inaction of Congress makes action at the state level vitally important. Many states are attempting to enact laws directly related to League of Women voter positions and advocacy at the federal level, such as voting rights, election reform, publicly funded elections, women's rights, and transparency. Be aware of pending legislation at the state level that impacts the structures of our democracy and parallel efforts at the federal level. Working on these issues at the state level reinforces efforts at the national level and builds grassroots awareness and advocacy for reform. Voting is in the top tier of advocacy priorities. Protecting and ensuring voter access to the polls is fundamental to our democracy. The voter is the most powerful antidote to money in our political system, and ensuring voter access and rights is a critical advocacy area for the League at all levels. Elizabeth McNamara, president of the League of Women Voters, puts it this way: "In the end, the only reliable response to a flood of money in our elections is a flood of voters at the polls, each voter armed with the kind of reliable, unbiased information that the League provides." There are multiple bills pending in Congress regarding disclosure, good government, amendments, and other campaign finance reforms. But low voter turnout is a serious issue across America. Based on statistics from 1948 to 2012, we know that about 60% of Americans tend to turn out for presidential contests. Midterms garner about 40% of voters. These figures are significantly lower than those for other established democracies, where voter turnout is in the 70 to 90% range. What we don't need is obstacles to voting. But as you may be aware, a flood of voter restriction laws have been enacted in state after state in recent years, laws sold to the public as combating fraud, in spite of numerous studies that show fraud is simply not an issue. However, controlling who votes has tremendous potential in determining winners and losers in elections. A modernized election system is also needed. Voter access and convenience need to be enhanced with provisions such as Election Day registration, key to increasing voter turnout, weekend and evening voting periods, and online voter registration. The federal government could also create federal standards for state corporate charter law that would level the playing field among states and regulate corporate behavior, and states, today, could actually enforce the provisions already embedded in their corporate charter laws related to responsible corporate behavior. Congress could also pass the American Anti-Corruption Act. This bill may be new to many of you. It was developed by the former George H.W. Bush-appointed FEC Chair, Trevor Potter, through his organization, the Campaign Legal Center. Jack Abramoff was one of the contributors. Abramoff was particularly qualified for this task, given his direct personal experience with political corruption. He was convicted in 2008 on corruption charges related to his lobbying activities and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The American Anti-Corruption Act addresses many of the issues discussed in this presentation. It would, among other things, establish a revenue source to fund a viable public campaign funding system, require donor disclosure of all contributions and expenditures, prohibit members of Congress from fundraising from interests they most directly regulate, eliminate pay-to-play opportunities, require longer waiting periods between public service and work as a lobbyist. Several bills aimed directly at curbing the corruption and abuses of money in the system have been introduced in Congress. The Empowering Citizens Act, January 2013, is considered the most comprehensive campaign finance reform legislation pending in the 2013-2015 congressional session. The bill would end individual candidate super PACs, repair the presidential public financing system, create an equivalent congressional public financing system, and strengthen the rules prohibiting coordination between outside spending groups and candidates. The Government by the People Act was introduced in February 2014 by Representative John Sarbanes of Maryland. As of July 2014, the bill had 157 co-sponsors. The focus of the Sarbanes bill is to create a viable public funding system for elections. If passed, the law would provide a refundable tax credit for citizens to spur small donor contributions for congressional office, conditional matching funds for donations up to $150, conditional additional resources to citizen-funded candidates in the home stretch of a campaign to maintain a level playing field. Money is necessary to run for office. The issue is where the money is coming from and the dependency of our politicians on the sources of funding. H.R. 20 attempts to shift the dependency away from the wealthiest percent of our population, the 1/10 of the 1%, to the 99.9% of the electorate by establishing a public funding system for elections. With regard to regulatory action, we saw a vivid example of the power of regulatory agencies in the President's release of the 2014 Climate Action Plan. The plan is closely tied to more stringent standards for carbon-based emissions proposed by the EPA the same year. In addition to the EPA, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Election Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the IRS are all regulatory agencies. An example of important regulatory action related to money in politics came from the Federal Communications Commission with the requirement, effective as of July 2, 2014, that all broadcast television stations in the country must post online copies of contracts and other information about the political advertisements they are airing, thereby providing easy access for voters interested in knowing who is buying campaign commercials and how much money the ad buyers are spending. Also on the regulatory front, the IRS is currently reviewing its regulations regarding 501c4s. The IRS has the authority to clarify and redefine 501c4 rules governing the political activities of social welfare organizations that are tax-exempt. The concern is that many social welfare organizations recognized by the IRS as tax-exempt engage in few, if any, direct social welfare services, and instead are primarily involved in actively raising and spending money on elections. The IRS proposed new guidance for 501c4s in February 2014. The League has commented on proposed changes and fully supports rapid action on an update. The Federal Election Commission is responsible for administering and enforcing the 1975 Federal Election Campaign Act, the statute that governs the financing of federal elections. The agency is widely viewed as ineffective because of its partisan composition. FEC commissioners are by appointment of the President and confirmed by the Senate. To be effective, the FEC needs to be nonpartisan and have enforcement teeth to regulate candidates, political parties, PACs, super PACs, and hybrid PACs. Finally, the Securities and Exchange Commission, a federal agency that oversees the stock market, has the authority to adopt a rule governing corporate political expenditures, including disclosure of political activities, donations and lobbying, and shareholder approval for political activity. The SEC declined to rule on these changes in 2013. Serious efforts to amend the Constitution as a way to confront concerns about money in politics and corporate personhood are also spreading across the country. 7 of the 27 existing amendments to the Constitution reversed previous Supreme Court decisions. Among those amendments reversing a Supreme Court decision was the 19th Amendment granting a woman's right to vote. As of June 2014, 12 state legislatures have passed resolutions calling on Congress to pass amendments addressing money in politics and corporate personhood, with similar resolutions pending in 18 more states. The amendment proposals getting the most attention focus on 2 main areas of concern: restoring the power of Congress and the states to regulate the raising and spending of money for elections, and limiting constitutional rights to human beings. The League of Women Voters is withholding endorsement of an amendment pending completion of a national study in 2015. Money's influence in electoral politics and how money has impacted government prior to and since Citizens United have been our focus up to this point. But as the slide shows, Citizens United, while a critical event, is just the tip of the iceberg. The Citizens United and McCutcheon rulings have served as a loud wake-up call to many Americans for the need for change. As the graphic shown says, instead of Citizens United, we need Citizens Uniting. The League and other good government organizations are doing the vital work of educating the public on the issues and on the regulatory, legislative, and constitutional tools available for change. But the challenges now are much greater than ever before. and all of us play a role in the outcome. Being informed and staying engaged are vital to effective citizen action. Follow the money. Learn who is funding candidates, sponsoring ads, and sending literature, and publicize this information. Websites like Open Secrets, MapLight, Sunlight Foundation, and Public Citizen provide fact-based information showing the money trail. Remember that there is support in numbers. Working within and supporting organizations that are dedicated to fair elections is informative and helpful. Connect with organizations dedicated to fair elections and campaign finance reform, like the League of Women Voters. Log on to their websites or subscribe to their online newsletters for current, nonpartisan information about election and campaign finance reform. Attend candidate events for all levels of political office, local, state, and national, and talk to candidates and legislators about the issues discussed tonight and your concerns as a voter. Ask candidates the straightforward question, if elected, what will you do to stop the influence of money in politics? Lobby your representatives to pass related state and national legislation. Write letters to the editor using templates provided by the League and other good governance groups. Become a citizen co-sponsor of the American Anti-Corruption Act and ask your friends and family to do the same. Share this presentation with an organization you belong to. And don't forget to vote, and to remind your friends and families to vote. Vote in all local, state, and federal elections. Don't willingly give up your most powerful weapon, your vote. A governing system that was originally designed to be dependent upon the people is now dependent upon a small minority of anonymous funders. As a nation, we've faced critical challenges to our democratic system in the past and have risen to the challenge. We've done it before, and we can do it again. Remember the Tillman Act, the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, the Federal Election Campaign Act, and McCain-Feingold. Let's work together again to make democracy work. Thank you for your attention and interest.